So, that is definitely one thing that you can do to stop the vocal fry from happening. Tongue tension can absolutely kill your voice, but it's just one part of the solution. You absolutely have to have enough air. Unfortunately, if we go back to looking at Dr. Fauci, the man is exhausted, understandably so, regardless of what your politics are. This man has been putting in a lot of hours. A lot was asked of him, and he's tired. If we're tired, we don't expand our torso. And when we don't expand our torso, we don't take in as much air. And if I really exaggerate that, all of a sudden I'm whispering. And then it might even go that far to go into the vocal fry. And then you can barely hear me. You need good rest. When you public speaking a lot, you need a lot of rest. And when you don't, caffeine is usually not the answer because that will dehydrate you and do away with the mucosal lining, which is the protective layer around the folds. So don't drink caffeine. You can jump up and down a little bit, just gently enough so that you wake up. If you have to give many interviews like he had to do, then try to stretch. You can't collapse your torso. Good posture is kind of everything when it comes to air. So, yeah. So, Dr. Fauci ended up getting vocal nodules. Let's talk about what those are and how he ended up getting them, and most importantly, how you can avoid getting vocal nodules when you suddenly have to speak a lot for your job. Nowadays, we have to create content, we're asked to speak in public, and this is something we've never really had to do before in technical professions like, I guess a pandemic expert? I don't know what the technical term is, but I don't recall a time in history when these people were being asked to speak in public time and time again. The point is, you never know when you're going to be asked to speak, and that's why we should cover basic general vocal health that you can use, and we're going to start right now. So the first thing we have to ask is, what are vocal polyps? This is what Dr. Fauci got from speaking incorrectly for long periods of time, so let's dig into what those are. Nothing like a Google search to get a nice image real quick. So, this is real simple. Normally, the vocal folds do not have anything obstructing them, okay? The way that the vocal folds generally come together, drop my paper here, is with something called the Bernoulli effect, and this is going to be important for later when we get into the nodules and polyps. But, for all intents and purposes, boom. You blow air through the folds, as my air conditioner comes on, great, and by blowing air through the folds come together. They make content, and then they start vibrating, and then vowels and consonants are made using our mouth and teeth and tongue. So, what happens when there is a bump on one or both of these pieces of paper folds? Let's talk about that. So right here is a nodule. A nodule is basically, if you've ever worked manual labor, or maybe you've played too many video games, or maybe you've played guitar, you start to develop callus from the constant friction on your skin. The dead skin cells accumulate and become calluses. It's a protective measure. The problem is your folds, for men, are about the size of a nickel. And that's the two of them combined, right? So when those two things come together and they have a little bump on them, it can obstruct the sound. Let's take a listen to Dr. Fauci in the beginning of the pandemic when he's speaking, and then later on when he presumably has the injury.
That if some areas, cities, states, or what have you, jump over those various checkpoints and prematurely open up without having the capability.
All right, so let's have a talk about this tone of voice that he is using. What he's doing is he's really having a vocal fry, and he's not doing his voice any favors by having a vocal fry. So what is a vocal fry? A vocal fry is what happens when your folds do not connect. They kind of flop around. So in that paper example I gave you where both of them came together, this is where they're just kind of touching and flopping and they're not really committing. And the principle remains the same. remember that those pieces of paper came together when we blew air through them. Well, if you don't blow enough air, you won't be able to connect your folds. And this means that they're slapping together like that. That causes a tremendous amount more callousing to happen, more dead skin cells to accumulate, because there's a little bit more of an aggressive adduction. Yes, that's the word. Adduction of the vocal folds. I know what I'm talking about. Boy, oh boy. Adduction is when it comes together. Abduction is when it's taken away. So, anyway, there's some vocal terminology for you. The second thing I'm happening to notice here is that his microphone is incredibly low. If you speak for long periods of time, it is an additional challenge to project. This is why opera singers don't sing 8 days a week and musical theater people do. Having a microphone is a technological asset. It is a tool. It is to help you. And I had to boost the gain on this video tremendously. So he's not close enough to the mic. He's not letting the microphone help him. So how do we take those two things, the vocal fry and having the appropriate levels on your microphone? How can we adjust those things? The microphone stuff I'm going to leave alone because it's very specific to whatever equipment that you're using, but I encourage you to really make sure that you do a sound test and that you understand your levels before you go live, or you make content, whatever. Talk to your sound guy if you have one. For the vocal fry stuff, we already explained that too little air causes that, but how can we make sure that we're doing not that, that we have healthy vocal closure? Well, here's an exercise that is absolutely ridiculous, but it's a great one. I call it the tongue fart. The tongue fart actually kills two birds with one stone, metaphorically, right? That is a loose tongue. How do I know it's a loose tongue? Well, you can't really move anything that's tight, right? If you take your bicep and you stiffen it, you tighten it, you tighten it, you tighten it, you're not going to be able to move it backwards because the bicep is tight. Same thing applies with the tongue. The tongue is a big muscle and can put a lot of pressure on the throat if it's tight. So that requires movement. And you'll know if it's tight because if it is tight, that's what's going to happen. So there's a big difference between and cool? Cool. One of the bigger questions is, how did they go from nodules to a full-on polyp that required surgery? Let's take a look at Dr. Fauci speaking later on during the pandemic and listen to his voice once again.
In the level of infection in different regions, states, cities, counties. So if you are in a green zone.
So one of the things you can hear that is a sign of vocal damage or a polyp is air seeping through. If the folds are sealed, air won't slip through. And even if you have vocal fry, you won't get that hissy white noise that you can kind of hear. Listen very carefully. It's kind of hard to hear, but you can hear it if you listen close enough.
Precautions, but you can open up the schools relatively easily.
That sound is the danger zone. Now, not only does he have a vocal fry, but he also has air seeping through his folds. Now, yes, he did do a lot of speaking, and undoubtedly a lot of it off camera as well. But there are people, vocal experts, rather, if you will, who use their voices all day. It's entirely possible, but it is challenging. In all fairness to Dr. Fauci, he never probably had to do this before. So this was a sudden demand. He did it in stride, and luckily, he's recovering from a vocal polyp surgery. But this stuff can be avoided, so make sure you're taking care of your vocal health. Dr. Fauci has had a lot of speaking demands placed upon him, but these are things that we're going to have to deal with in the future as we have to create more content as speakers, as we might be asked to speak when we're not ready. Vocal health is important for darn near any profession. I've been singing opera for 14 years. I have a degree in this, and we're going to jump into how Dr. Fauci damaged his voice and what you can do to make sure that you don't.